So with any great luck, since we practiced a little bit of this last night, I'll be able to stomp on the share screen function and open a PowerPoint without too much hesitation. I've got to say thanks to John Medley for boosting me along to putting a background photo so that you don't see my living room wall or something. The background is of our Club Grove over the desert near where we fly, quite close to El Mirage. And so that dresses things up a little bit and helps the presentation. We're going to open my PowerPoint here, I think. And we're going to do a slideshow from the beginning.
There you go.
And maybe we have me as a speaker in a side window, or maybe not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so, you're down there after fourth in line.
Yeah, I don't know how that part works, but
whoever got on first order, first come, first serve.
Oh my gosh! So that's how it was. So I guess I was trying to be on time this evening. That's a new trend.
What can we say, Cindy?
Trying to stick with that resolution, John. Be on time. So
you live on desert time.
Anyhow, this series was started by Chris, who added his glider rating with us at Antelope Valley Club, and was a way to share information and help our cross-country beginners. And he said, well, if we're going to go cross-country, oh my God, we're going to be landing out. And my response was, landing out should not be an oh my God moment. But it has been over the years for many sailplane pilots, and we'd like to share some learning information so that maybe it's not. Have I gone cross-country? Yes, I have. I have a U.S. Diamond Badge 852, which is an indication of flying to a goal and flying a minimum distance of 500 kilometers. I also had a really great solo free distance day during the Dust Devil Dash quite a few years back now. But I flew from Tehachapi to Elko, Nevada, and that's illustrated in the Google Earth picture in the upper right corner of your screen. You can see it crosses a couple of states, and Salt Lake wasn't so very far away if I'd gone a little more east that afternoon. In past years, when I was flying more actively in single-seaters, I set a few U.S. national speed and distance records. Most of them have been superseded now by another young lady who's flying. But over the years, with my exposure to different pilots in different places, I got invited to be a safety pilot for dual cross-country work in an Arcus jet self-launching glider. And in that role with that pilot, we had my two biggest back-to-back days of flying out of Minden and up and down the Sierras in cross-country wave. And inside a day and a half, the bottom line of the page is most pertinent. Inside a day and a half, I spent 22, almost 23 hours aloft, and we accrued more than 1,600 miles of cross-country flight. Those were a long couple of days, some beautiful pictures, some great memories. But that isn't where we started, and that isn't how this session is to address cross-country flying. I started in a Blahnik as a club airplane here in Southern California. I had club instructors who mentored me in terms of making safe decisions and getting started and going places. I made my first personal achievement flights in a 126 in California and in Texas. And in Texas, I used one of that club's 126s for my first silver distance flight. I rode along in two-seaters whenever I could. I listened to all the soaring stories that I could and tried to absorb information from wherever it might have been available. When we talk about landing out in cross-country flight, we talk about what are the risks of landing out. What are the things that make landing out an oogie boogie goblin in people's minds? It could be in an unwanted place. It could have unwanted difficulty at that place. It could involve an unwanted commitment of time to be able to retrieve the glider. Or it could be an oogie boogie thought because of the unknown. We don't know how to look at places and evaluate them for their landing characteristics. But we can mitigate all of those things. We can keep safe glide discipline by calculating our performances and not end up at unwanted places. In terms of mitigating difficulty, you should be able to touch and stop in 500 feet or less of ground roll, or don't go cross country. If you haven't practiced landings at home well enough to be able to accurately land anywhere on your home airfield, anywhere that a friend bets you a soda pop, hey, can you land in this particular spot on the airfield? If you can't stop in 500 feet, you should not be going cross country. The unwanted time for an awkward retrieve from a silly place, that can be mitigated by keeping glide discipline. If you need more information about keeping glide discipline, we'll talk about it a little bit here today, but you can also go to the SSA.org website for webinars and look at my webinar that I did a year or so ago on secrets of glider math. For the fear of the unknown, you can develop visual assessment skills. Those skills don't have to be gained in a cockpit going cross country. The things that we're going to talk about here tonight are things that you can practice sitting at your computer at home to a great degree. And what preparation you do at home, looking at particular sites, then you can match those up by making a drive and looking at those potential places along your intended course line. Since we're talking about beginner cross-country flights, those courses should be small enough in distance for beginners that it's easy enough to drive that in an afternoon's outing. And we can do that afternoon outing in the winter or early spring before our best soaring weather is developed. Do you have to land out to go cross-country? What is a land out? Lots of people think that a land out is a horrible thing. All it really means is that we landed someplace not where we took off. And we can keep those risks pretty small by making those acceptable choices: airports, dry lakes in the western states, agricultural strips if we've pre-inspected them, or known safe land out spots that have been inspected and reported between us from glider pilot to glider pilot. We have considerably more risk and considerably more potential expense if we choose farm fields, if we haven't ascertained what the weather has been in the recent last few days along our intended course line, and we don't know that the thunderstorms have made that dry lake now wet and slimy. Roads are not a good place for aircraft to land. They might be easy for the emergency vehicles to get to the mess that's left, but it's really not a good place for aircraft. And I really hope I don't have to choose random raw countryside. We can reduce our risks in landouts by training, by having precision landing skills. To be a private pilot in gliders and to own your own sailplane or to have cross-country privileges is typically associated with being a private certificated pilot or a higher rating. The practical test standards say that for accuracy landing practice, the designated examiner is going to define a threshold place and define a stopping place. And those two definitions are going to be short enough to be slightly demanding for the weather and for the aircraft that you're using. It may be 300 or 400 feet for a 126 and a private pilot on a calm day. It may be 300 or 400 feet for a duodiscus on a very, very windy day. But the examiner is going to change that distance that's allowed for the test based on the equipment and the weather and the surface that's being used. If you're landing in soft soil, your stopping distance is going to be a lot shorter. If you're landing on the paved asphalt of an airport, your landing distance is typically going to be a lot longer. But you need to be able to touch and stop in less than 500 feet in calm weather without abusing your glider. You should be using an approach configuration that's medium dirty, 1/3 to 1/2 spoilers, all the way across base leg and all the way up final. That half dirty configuration is what allows us to change configuration to absorb and counterbalance the changes that we find in the atmosphere during base and final. If we encounter strong sink, we can clean up. If we encounter strong lift, we can dirty out all the trash on the glider. And that allows us to still fly that medium approach configuration at home while we're practicing, so that we can translate those same visual angles and those same configuration tools to a different place that we select on a new airport or on a new outlanding place. Risk reduction through glide slope discipline. You're the one who chooses how much risk you create or you accept. You can choose to reduce that risk by landing on airports, by anticipating places that are even serviceable enough that you might use an aero retrieve. That can allow you to have a very predictable time outcome. If we talk about the Southern California area, if we were talking about taking off out of Cal City or Tehachapi or over here at Crystal Air and heading north towards the Sierras, a lot of us already know that if we go land at Kelso Valley Airport, wow, it's on the chart, we know how to get there, we've got directions, but time-wise, that's not going to be a very predictable time outcome. It takes a long time to drive in off the highway to that place. You can choose whether you're going to use dry lakes or agricultural crop duster strips. You can choose what altitude you want to arrive over the field for your planning, for your glide slope discipline, and what reduction of your planning L over D you're going to use to have some performance buffer on each little leg, each little step of your task. When we talk about setting up the difficulty or the coordination with our flight planning ahead of time as a beginning cross-country pilot, we can choose whether we're going to have technology in the cockpit to support us, or whether we're going to use extremely simple, extremely reliable, old school technology. And that's what I'm going to talk about for my beginners today. But for the folks who are beyond beginner level, if you install a new glide computer, if you install a new moving map, if you install new software to upgrade that system, you are choosing a level of complexity, and you need to be familiar with that before you get in the cockpit to go on a really good day. We said that this evening's seminar was going to be initially intended for the beginning Antelope Valley cross-country students. Our airport for the Antelope Valley Club is located quite close to El Mirage Dry Lake, a little bit to an easterly position from Crystal Air Glider Port, a little bit westerly from Crayfield, or from SoCal Logistics, Victorville, the formerly known as George Air Force Base. The large red rectangle in this is a rectangle that I defined and had some volunteers do some Condor database upgrading to be able to use on the Condor 2 system for some flight planning and some flight practicing to begin some of this coursework for our club pilots. But the old school version is to have a sectional chart and to draw circles of a known dimension around the places that we intend to use as safe, comfortable, no oogly goblin mental distress over perhaps landing there. There may be other places that are not airports that we might also mark on our charts and indicate with some different color coding. In this illustration that you're looking at now, these are 5 statute mile circles. I don't need that, baby. 5 statute mile circles in green around airports. The same 5 statute mile circles, because we're working with 126s and 134s. And if you were working with a PIC, an ASW20, an ASW27, something that had your airspeed indicator calibrated in knots for nautical miles, you might want to use nautical mile circles so that we're using the same dimensions for distances and for speed calculations, okay? This drawing is using statute mile circles because of the equipment the club kids are going to be using. The red circles are non-airports, okay? So I reviewed this program a little bit with Chris, and I said, hey, Chris, can you name all the airports in these circles? Mike Newgard used to fly down here. He can probably name a few of them. John Chapman can probably name a few of them. If you are intending to make a course line flight cross country, you should be able to name all of the available airfields in your neighborhood without having to focus on the chart to look them up. But we find as we step from Antelope Valley Club toward a goal of Tehachapi Gliderport, Skylark North, that's a 95-kilometer flight. It's more than enough for silver distance. If my club guys took a local tow on Saturday and one pilot flew and one pilot followed as crew, and they landed at Tehachapi successfully on Saturday, on Sunday morning, they could swap roles. The other guy gets in the glider and takes a tow on Sunday morning and repeats the flight, headed back to home. You can use that strategy with other club groups or with other partnerships to split the load and share the learning and make it a fun time for everybody. The tinted airspace here is the restricted airspace for 2515 for Edwards Air Force Base. It's not perfectly marked. I'm the one who created the vignette overlay there. It's not the same accuracy as using a sectional chart, but this is something that you can do with Google Earth at home to help you do course planning. Performance calculations. We said for the purpose of the club that we were most likely using Schweitzer equipment, 126s or 134s. And in the lower left corner of this slide, I've got the LD for a 126, the LD for a 134, for a Grobe, for a duodiscus. You can pick your make model sailplane, choose a similar LD, and then we're going to take a look at what the real mathematics is for altitude loss for 1 mile. And then what Cindy says you should calculate roughly for that 1 mile. If we were flying a 30-to-1 sailplane, which is the 134, it should only lose 176 feet a mile. But hey, your speed to fly isn't so accurate, and your course line flying isn't so accurate, and your distraction while you refold your map or while you push a button on your radio isn't so accurate. Use a rule of thumb, bump that up, and say it's going to cost you 200 feet per mile to go someplace. And that's pretty close to what the glider should give you. But if you're using that 134 and it should give you 200 feet per mile, downgrade it for your beginning flights or on your days when you're flying and you don't have a crew and you'd like to be certain that you make it home. If we look at what the bronze badge training material says, or what the FAA written test material says, the FAA says degrade your performance by 50%. Oh my God. All right. If we want to get someplace, let's degrade that performance by 30% perhaps. You'll still get somewhere and you'll still have a really comfortable performance margin that's going to guarantee that you make it onto your chosen acceptable landing alternatives. That's your first buffer for safety margins for performance. Your second buffer is what arrival altitude are you going to use for that new place? Maybe you're going to a glider competition or a glider safari to some place that you haven't flown before. Rather than using I've flown 600 flights out of my home glider port and it's okay to come screaming back to the pattern at 1,000 AGL because I know what my runway alternatives are and I won't know where my parking spot is and I know where the windsock is. I can make a quick acquisition of all that information and enter the pattern at 1,000 feet and be fine. But that doesn't really give you any planning time. If you plan to arrive over your new landing place on your early cross-country flight or at your new contest site or your new safari site, plan to arrive 2,000 above the earth. That gives you time to look around. While you're looking at the ground and assessing the facilities and the premises, you can also see what your wind drift is. Don't be counting on electronic gizzies in the cockpit to tell you that the wind is from 223 degrees at 11.5 knots. Use your wind drift. If you notice that, it's real. If you don't notice any drift, it's pretty irrelevant. Glide calculation practice. So a couple of you guys, unmute your microphone and we'll play the game of Cindy Math a little bit to practice glide calculations. The things that we're going to do pretending that we're a 134, we're going to look at our first stepping stone jump, our first lily pad jump across the pond from AVSC to Crystal Air. How far is it? We need to know how far we're trying to step. And we're going to use 300 feet per mile as our performance for our 134. When we know our mileage times 300 feet, we're going to add our arrival altitude and our field elevation, and we'll know what we need to have on the altimeter to be able to make that jump. So think about which one of these questions, gentlemen, you want to play with to answer with me. Antelope Valley to Crystal, how far is it? Crystal Air to Fox, how far is it? Fox to Mojave, how far is it? And we're going to do the mathematics. But to do that, you need a sectional. For these beginning kids, they may not really know how to use a sectional chart. Okay? So we're going to talk very briefly about how easily we can use this. Antelope Valley Club is a strip that is not even on the chart. It happens to be located about the letter A in Adelanto here, where I've got my little laser pointer zooming around. Okay, so at that A in Adelanto to Crystal Air is going to be our first jump. Sectional charts have these wonderful things called latitude and longitude lines on them. These big grid marks if you zoom out further away on them. And we can say that from one line of longitude to the next big line of longitude is 30 miles, amazingly enough. And if we start here as 0, here's the 10-mile hash mark, here's the 20-mile hash mark, here's the 30 miles. So even just sitting here in front of your computer screen, you can take your index finger and put the tip of your index finger at Crystal Air and the heel of your knuckle back up towards the A in Adelanto. See how long that is stretched and compare it to that latitude longitude line. And count how many tick marks you need to have to reach from AVSC to Crystal. Or if somebody else thought they were going to take the Crystal Air to Fox Field leg, at least 10, maybe 20. We can estimate this on the sectional chart, even if we've put no personal markings on it. Oh, I'm going to go back. Okay. So who wants to guesstimate here? Who's going to tell me how far it is from AVSC to Crystal Air? Walt, you got
12 miles, 12 nautical.
Okay. 12 times 300 is how much?
3,000,
three.
let's see, 3,600 feet, right?
Right. 12 times 3, 12, 24, 36. 3,600 plus 2,000 is how much? 36, 46, 56,
56.
right?
Yeah, 56 plus 3,500 at the ground.
Okay. So 56 plus 35, 8,
9,000.
9,000? 9,000 will get us there. Wow. Did that go easy enough for us, John?
That's hard. I'm not used to doing those calculations. I'll let the computer do it.
Yeah, I know. But what if you run out of battery at the end of the day? What if you run
I got
out
lots of
at the end
batteries.
the day? Yeah. Okay. So these are for the beginners.
Sectional and nautical miles?
Yeah,
Actually,
if you're using a map, aeronautical map, you really got to use nautical miles because of what Cindy said. You've got those convenient little
you got your tick.
latitude, longitude tick marks on there.
Okay. But we're going back to kindergarten for some of you guys. Okay. But really and truly, I can tell you about a fellow in a discus that came down from I don't know, BASA or Northern Cal Soaring Association, I'm not sure which. He brought his discus down in April one year, and he loaded up his database in his discus, and he flew out to Red Mountain on a not great afternoon and turned around to come back, and he was at Red Mountain at 5,500 MSL, which is just barely above the earth out there, and his computer told him he could get home. He didn't do this common sense check of, gee, it's 12 miles times 300 feet per mile is 36, and 36 and 35 is 61 or so, okay? So we can do some really quick mathematics in the cockpit, plus the 2,000 for the pattern, that gets us up into the 8,000 foot range, that gets us there without having to worry about landing out at Bryan Ranch or any of the other dirt strips along the way, okay? So this quick mathematics, got to go the right way. Crystal Air to Fox. Anybody look up how far that was while we were looking at the sectional chart?
It was about 20 miles.
Okay, or we can go back to here. If we had a chart that had circles on it, we could say, well, here was Crystal and here was Fox, and that radius, not the circumference, was 5 miles. Can I put another whole circle in here? I probably can. There's another 10 and at least another radius. So it's almost 25 miles by looking at this really, really quickly. 25 times 3 is how much, John?
75.
Okay. And we're going to add 2,000 to that.
95.
Okay. And the elevation at Fox was? Yeah, got to go back one.
Long one.
Okay. Still 2,500 or so at Fox. Okay. So 25. Yeah. So to leave Crystal Air and know that I'm not going to have any problems with the guys at Palmdale and reach Fox, It didn't take us any time at all to figure out that we needed 12,000 feet to make that jump. Do we always get 12,000 foot days at Crystal Air?
Mhm.
Not when you need it.
Not when you need it. Not when you need it. Okay. So we'll talk about how we fix that little problem in a minute. But for the beginner, he says, if I get to 12,000 feet at Crystal Air, not on the ridge out here to the south, but at Crystal Air, and I want to make that in one jump without thinking about turning back at all, 12,000. Okay. So you can see how this really quick distance plus feet per mile, add 2,000 for arrival, add the field elevation, it gets you some glide slope practice really quickly without taking up a lot of mental energy, without having to have any electronic tools in the cockpit. It might be nice if we had them, but if they die or if our database got screwed up and we had to pull out that ratty old out-of-date sectional chart, we have a tool. Huh? Oh, but what about the wind? Okay. A lot of guys are going to say, what about the wind here? And I'm going to say, okay, we don't have to make this very complicated. Normally we'd use 300 feet per mile for our glider with its degraded performance. We'll say, how much headwind do we have? Gee, Walt, what kind of a headwind do we have in the desert in the afternoon frequently?
Well, 15 knots, gust, maybe
That's
15
not
to 20.
unusual. Yeah, that's not unusual at all. But we say, what percentage of that is the wind to our best LD speed? We know the best LD speed for the glider.
Yeah, it's about a third.
It's about a third. So if we take our current spending rate of altitude on a calm day and we add 30% to it, we've simplified this and come up with 400 feet per mile. That's what we're going to substitute on a day that has wind. And that'll still keep us above glide to the safe landing spots. And that's what we're out to do. We're out to mitigate risk and know that we're going to achieve the spot that we're willing to land. Now we're going to talk about the really fun stuff. You guys don't want to talk about math, even though that keeps your butt out of the weeds. I'd like to talk about visual skills for ascertaining an acceptable landing spot from the air. And the Cindy acronym for this is STOP. Please simply stop soaring and start a good landing. And we're going to stop soaring by case studying a landing spot based on its acceptable size, based on any sloping direction that it might have, which way's uphill, which way's downhill. What kind of texture do we have on that place? Are there any obstacles, either in the surface of what we're landing on or on the premises around? I know a couple of guys that have landed at Inyokern. Lovely airport, enormous runways, long runways. And the guy decides to taxi off without really thinking about it because, oh, I need to get off the runway in a hurry. And he ran into a ground obstacle. He attacked a runway light with his wing. Totally preventable, okay? But he wasn't thinking about the obstacles on the ground. He just says, oh, I could taxi off the runway and not have to push it on this late, hot afternoon. Okay? After those obstacles, we want to think about what kind of positive points does this landing area have? Where would be road access? Where would be communications? Where would be services? We want to have a positive outlook about making this landing because it's at a spot that we chose, okay? If we talk about personality traits in flying, do we say, oh, I just have to land here, I haven't really planned it? That's just sort of given up. Have we said, I'm going to push this glider into this landing spot even though it's not great? That's not That's more being macho about it a little bit rather than being logical about it. Okay. So personality plays some into our landing out at these selected spots, or the style of spots that we select. Okay. When did we make the decision that we're going to execute a land out? Hopefully we made that commitment before we even took off. We planned to go someplace. This wasn't happenstance. Okay. Did we have other places that we could have used that were within range so we're better? How high above the ground did we commit to starting a good landing? When we talk about analyzing the surface and the skills that we need to have to decide about size and slope and texture, we're going to talk about each one of these individually. How big of a place do we need to land on? We know the span of our glider, but we need to decide what is an acceptable span for us. For a beginning cross-country pilot, I would venture to say they need at least 1.5 times their span for an acceptable width. And this is going to be important in a couple of minutes. We said that as a private rated pilot who has a club privilege to go cross-country or is trying to not have to call Costello for an insurance claim, that we need more than 500 feet in length. Bigger is better. Okay? Bigger is better. Okay? When we say, what's the slope on our site that we've chosen to land? If we've chosen to land on an airport, most times the slope isn't very significant. But we have had glider operations off of places that are unidirectional runways. We had a contest at Taft. You land west and you take off east because there's a lot of slope. If we ask ourselves, where's the closest mountain, we pretty much know which way is uphill, okay? Without getting too technical about, can I visually see slope when I'm looking down from my cockpit under my belly? Texture. We can find out about texture of the foliage that's growing on this by color, by shadows, by comparison to the surrounding fields, by contrast. When we talk about texture, not only do we have foliage, we might have vehicle tracks, motorcycle tracks, off-road vehicles. We might have farm equipment that has left furrows. When we talk about texture, we want to know, is any of this stuff wet or dry? And what is its relative humidity? Okay? If we look at a place for obstacles, if we have committed to land on this place from 2000 AGL and we say, we're not going to screw around anymore, we're going to concentrate on making a beautiful landing, we can fly a circumference around this place. And if we fly a circumference around this place, the light will change on the obstacles. And it helps us pick up on those contrasts on the surface. And we want to be happy about this place that we're going to land and be convinced that we're going to do a good job. If it's an airport, it's got access to the trailer, it's got communications, it might have a cafe for lunch services. We want to be happy about the place that we're landing rather than convince ourselves that it's horrible and everybody's going to be unhappy with us. In the desert, in the Antelope Valley, we have section lines. We have field squares. If we talk about El Mirage years ago, we had alfalfa planted around the runways. Do we know how big those field squares are? Anybody? Does anybody know how big a section of ground is?
Mile, give or take.
A mile, give or take, okay? Does anybody know what the distance is between 90th Street and 80th Street in the Antelope Valley? Or the distance between Avenue A and Avenue B?
2 miles.
Yeah, 1 mile, and that's
1
okay.
mile.
And a
1 mile.
statute mile to boot.
A statute mile to Butte, which helps that 126 or that 134. And if you count it as a mile, you're going to actually have a little bit of extra altitude or energy in the bank. If Sean's flying his pretty DG glider and he's calculating things for nautical miles, those statute miles click off a little quicker for him. Okay. So the section field grids give us one way of measuring things. Another way of measuring things is scale and comparison. How wide is an automobile from a rear view mirror on one side to the rear view mirror on the other side? The outside dimensions of your automobile. What's the widest it can be? Anybody?
It's
7
about
feet.
8 feet, isn't it?
8 feet is wide.
I'll take John
Fine.
Medley. I'll take John Medley at 8 feet. That works. Okay. That's federal highway traffic standards. Okay. It doesn't matter whether it's a Freightliner or whether it's a Lincoln Continental or whether it's an F-150 crew car, the vehicle is 8 feet wide maximum. So how wide is a single lane of traffic?
12.
Somebody got the right answer. I don't know who it was, but I'm glad that you guys are playing with me. Okay, this is how you learn. So a paved lane from the center line stripe to the edge marker where they paint the bicycle lane, 12 feet. So if we're flying a discus sailplane or a pick or an ASW-20, one of you guys, I don't care, maybe Mike or maybe Alex, how many lanes of traffic do you need to be able to have 1.5 times your span?
6.
Cool. Isn't that amazing? Do you guys know of anything in the Antelope Valley that's 6 lanes of traffic wide? I sure don't. I sure don't. Okay. But now we're going to talk about the bushes that we looked at in the field. And we know that a single lane of traffic as an ATV path in the desert is 8 feet. A single lane of traffic on that county road with pavement was 12 feet. So now if I look at a bush has an aspect ratio of 1:1. Its height and its width is pretty much the same. If it's a tree, the aspect ratio is different. Okay? But if we look at the lane width and the bush width, we now know how high the bushes are. Pretty close. Close enough. It's an interesting tool. We can also look at shadows. If we're landing late in the day, at the end of our soaring experience, those shadows tell us about berms and embankments. They tell us about furrows and ditches. And those shadows can also tell us about the foliage height. Now we're going to have fun. We're out over the Antelope Valley. We're somewhere between AVSC and Tehachapi. And you can do this at home, pulling up Google Earth along your course line. Okay? So I very kindly left you the road descriptors so that you can cheat and use these to help you with scale. But if we look at the typical alfalfa rancher, wherever he may be out here, and we say, what are the sizes of his property from east to west or from north to south, we can make a pretty good estimation about size of the various agricultural fields. So let's pick on somebody who hasn't talked yet. Byron, are you out there with your microphone turned on? Maybe. We'll pick on somebody that I saw earlier. We say, if we wanted to land in this little strip of field, how long is it? Maybe Byron doesn't have his microphone on. Who else is in there? I had a Kyle guy on this group.
2 sets a mile. So that's 2,500 feet.
So somebody's gone back to the business of this is a mile square and this is a mile square because we've gone from 90th to 100th to 110th. So this was a mile. So this was a half a mile here next to the N5.
I think it's around 2,500 feet.
Wow, cool, 2,500 feet. Is that long enough for us to land in?
Oh, God,
Sure.
yes.
Oh, God, yes.
Give or take
Okay.
a furrow.
Oh, somebody's worried about furrows. Somebody's going to be worried about whether we choose this patch or whether we choose this patch. Which way are the furrows going to be in these fields? North and
North to south.
south or east and west?
North to south.
Okay. And which way are the irrigation lines going to be lying in these fields?
Probably the same.
East to west.
Yeah, they're east to west.
In
Is it-
meters will be east-west, but most of the sprinkler lines will be north-south.
Ah, and that's where it becomes interesting. We're going to be a student of biology. The water line is going to lay, the sprinkler line is going to lay this way, but it's going to roll on its wheels this way. Okay. And we can see that in terms of the farmer is irrigating this piece because he's waiting for it to finish growing before he mows it. Okay. And so the wheel lines move from the east to the west on their big, huge wheels, but the wheels are radial to the axis of the water line. Okay. So the span of the water line is here and its direction of moving is here. So there'll be some chunks where those wheels lie in the field. So that's something to think about when we look at the shape of the field. What kind of irrigation? What kind of irrigation do we have on these fields?
Rotary. Circular.
Yeah, it's called center pivot irrigation. And you can see the pie wedge down here where a little bit of water has been sprayed on it. So in this whole circle, there's only one physical structure, which is from the radial point, one line on a radius to the perimeter, to the circumference of the circle. So there's not as much physical stuff to have to avoid. What can we say about the texture in this field that we would have to deal with if we were going to land on it?
It's curved.
Ruts are circular.
Yay, Bill Palmer. So you can't roll all the way across the length of this sucker because somewhere in here you can even see a little bit of the reflectivity of the water line laying there. But what you don't see is the divots in the dirt for the wheels that take it all the way around the center pivot. Okay. So anybody have a vote as to which field in all of this drawing they might want to use to land in? Who's got a vote?
I like E Avenue, that dry one up there.
Which way am I going to move my laser pointer, Chris?
To the north and central. Up and over. That one possibly is.
Why do you like that one?
Because it hasn't been used in a long time, so it's fallow ag field, so there's not any current agricultural activity on it.
Okay. So Walt, if we're at this altitude, are we worried about a landing place yet?
Nope.
Okay, but we might. Oh, wrong way. Let's go this way. We have wind in the Antelope Valley.
Mhm.
That's our course line, and that's our wind line for headwind. Okay. So, Chris, which way are you likely to use your selected field?
I'm going to be landing to the west, east.
Okay.
Sorry, going east, heading east.
You gonna land going this way?
Yeah, I want to land into the wind.
So we're gonna land going west. Okay. This is what this field looks like when we descend to 2000 AGL.
Nice.
That looks good.
Somebody likes it.
Yep. Land in the furrows, roll up just short of the road.
Are we gonna roll short of this road or are we gonna roll short of this road?
No, they'll stay in the middle. You have a lot more options.
There we go. We like that thought. Because if we screw up as a beginning student and we don't manage to stop in, how long was this?
That was about 2,500 feet.
Well, I don't.
Or no, a little less than that.
A mile, isn't it?
About
No.
1,200 feet.
Yeah, it's half of that, 1250.
Yeah, 1,250. Yeah.
Okay. So it shouldn't really be a stretch to get stopped in 1250.
No, no.
Okay. But I have seen somebody land a Club Janus years ago in the Tehachapi Valley, not understanding which direction the wind was blowing. He decided that the two airports were too close together and he went to land in a farm field. And it was kind of like this. There was a little path in the middle of the farm field and he landed in the second half of the tailwind and he came darn close to running out of field. Bunch of mistakes made. But anyway, the statement that, hey, let's pick the early part of what's serviceable and end up in the middle, that's okay. That's okay. Particularly if we're flying an approach that's medium dirty, that means we never have to worry about being short. We're not making flat, low, clean approaches. So we talked a little bit about texture. We can see furrows, okay? We can see that there's access to this place. Can we tell anything about slope?
A little bit from the stains of the, there's probably a depression about 2/3 of the way through it where the darkness is.
So we got something here that indicates water flow over the edges. Yep, you're right. So it may not be perfectly level, okay? And that same indication in the field exists outside the field. Huh? Oops, going the wrong way. So if we come back to here, we say, if we look at this outside of the field from really high, there's a little bit of a hint of color flow. And there's a little bit of hint of color flow in the native vegetation. Okay, the farmers smooth a lot of that out, but yeah, the water in the desert flows to the dry lakes. Huh? All right, size is good, slope is okay, texture is pretty good compared to the stuff on the other side of the road. We talked about using lanes of traffic. How wide was one lane of traffic compared to the size of the bushes? Well, you don't see at 2000 AGL much for a way of bushes out here in the middle. But if we picked one of these bushes alongside the edge, how big might this bush be?
Like 12 feet.
6 to 8.
No, that's only about 4 feet. It's 4 or 5 feet
120.
wide.
We're comparing it to a lane of traffic. Okay. And so if we come over here and we look at some of the bigger bushes in this field, we can compare that to a lane of traffic. Farmers frequently drive their tractor around the margins of the field. And so we can feel relatively assured that whatever's out here is probably under 4 feet. Now we took wonderful tool, Google Earth, and we said, how many lanes of county road? 2 lanes, 24 feet. A lane of shoulder, and there was a lane of shoulder on the other side.
That's sort of half.
Probably 6 feet.
Okay, but is the next piece of nakedness out here, is this the same elevation as the roadbed?
Nope.
No.
Nope.
No. So unless Mike's got a lot of dihedral on his Slingsby dart or something, he's not gonna make it work on this without getting to some of these hazards that are on the edge of the road. This is one of the reasons roads with real estate signs and mailboxes and telephone poles and old dead couches nowadays are really not good places to land. And when we looked at this photograph from above, before it had a water line laying in it and it leaked and it had some bushes. Most of those bushes went away. But again, how big is this one compared to
12 feet, 15 feet.
yeah. So we learn a lot, we learn a lot by looking at texture by comparison to the lanes and the shoulders of the county road that your crew's coming along. Huh? This is the road up the middle. We got 1,200 feet over here, and we got 1,200 feet over here. Does it look like there's any problem landing in that, John Medley?
Not really.
Not really. Pretty good place. Look good from 8,000 feet, look good from 2,000 feet. And by the time we put our sneakers on it, which we should do, if we're flying to Tehachapi over here, we should have put our sneakers on this if we intended to use it as an alternate on our cross-country task. So how tall a day do we need to have in terms of thermals to be able to get from AVSC at 3,000 foot field elevation using these stepping stones across the desert to Tehachapi? And you can draw this little drawing as a beginning pilot or even as a cross-country pilot going further away rather than the clear nav amoeba of what you can reach and you can't because Peavine Mountain is in your way. Okay, you can draw this kind of a picture to have a better idea, and you can draw the 6,000 foot MSL arrival above your field elevation, and you can draw stupid little angles with our 300 feet per mile. If I've got to go 15 miles, 15 times 3 is 45, 45 plus 4 is 95. Okay, and 6,000? Okay. So we've got a fast way to draw a picture. My math might have not been so good night before last. Okay, but we've got a way to draw a fast picture of how high we have to thermal up here to be able to get there. And we can do these fast calculations for each leg. But we said way back over here when we were talking about going from Crystal Air to Fox at 28 miles, that we really needed a 12 or 14,000 foot day at Crystal Air, not on the mountains back at Baden-Powell. We needed a pretty tall day to make sure that we were going to slat on the runway at Fox. But is that how we really go cross country? Not quite. We don't have to wait for the one perfect day in a summer to be able to achieve this. We need to calculate a middle point for going ahead or going back. And we can do these same calculations really, really quickly and just draw them out as hundreds of feet. And we can even transpose these numbers to be tape marked onto our chart or written onto our sectional chart so that we don't have to do so much math in the cockpit for a given day. And we can do those same go ahead or go back points for this 23-mile leg. 25 times 3 is 75. But I'm only going to take half of that. So I'm going to take 12 miles times 3 is 3,600 feet. And 36 and 25 is 61. And a 2,000 foot arrival is 81, going forward or going back. So I reduced the thermal quality of the day that was required to still be able to step across the desert with reasonable guarantees that I'm going to land someplace that's acceptable. And those are go, no go points. And that's why you had to do them for your private pilot test. But gee, with your electronic gizzies, for most of the guys that I'm talking to tonight, You aren't thinking about that so much anymore. You can do these same mathematic exercises in pre-flight by calculating your estimated wind for the afternoon and having all this math done before you ever take off. If we talk about wanting to have safe cross-country flights, we have to have some skills. And if we're going to land someplace where we've never landed before, whether that's an airport or a dry lake or a farmer's field that's fallow, we have to have landing accuracy or we shouldn't go. We need to have glide slope discipline to be able to stay above glide for the places we are willing to land. You don't just say, oh, 300 feet won't matter. I'll go ahead anyway. Nope. That's a sucker move. You make your own judgments, you make your own buffers, and you stick to them with self-discipline. There's nobody else there in the cockpit to do that except you. We can visually assess potential landing sites from altitude. And we can do that with great accuracy by using scale and comparison. And we practiced that. We looked at those fields and we talked about it a little bit. We can do it by stopping, soaring. What's the size? What's the slope? What's the texture? What are the obstacles? Were there phone poles? Were there ditches? Were there fences? Okay. And I've done all of that assessment and it's a pretty good place to land. Okay. We're still going to do our landing checklist about wind and approach speeds. That's different from assessing the site. Okay. And then we execute our landing plan because we started this high enough above the ground to leave time for our pre-landing checklist, to make sure that our flaps are set, to make sure that the water's out, to make sure that the gear is down. But those are the skills we need to have to make the bugaboos go away. If we're doing this beginner flight, it might take us 4 or 5 hours to get there. That's just the flight time. What's the prep time that we should truly invest in being ready to go? We got to decide if the weather's suitable for a given day. If there's anything that's happening that makes that course line not viable. Do we have TFRs? Do we have airspace restrictions? If we're using a course line for a task that we've set for ourselves, we should have checked our land out sites. We should love our glider enough and our grandkids enough to do a sneaker check on that site. There's differences that you'll find by looking at it from the ground this spring versus looking at it from Google Earth with a photo that's 4 years old. Okay? We can do glide slope planning on our chart. That takes some preparation time. If we're a beginner cross-country person and we don't know who's crewing for us, we have to invest some time crew training. Are we going to do that in the 20 minutes prior to hooking up our tow rope? I hope not. We have to have the car and the trailer ready to go. We have to have the glider ready to go with the systems that are in it, batteries charged, oxygen full, not having flat tail wheel dollies, all those sorts of things. If we have software in the cockpit, we have to know how to run it. We don't try to figure it out 30 minutes before we go today. We need to prepare for the pilot. And if we expect helpers, we need to do them the courtesy of speaking to them before 20 minutes before launch. So if we look at all this list and we say, what's the time that's required to do a good job for 1 5-hour flight? We better have started on Monday.
Yeah. Yeah.
Started on Monday.
Five times that 5 hours.
5 times that 5 hours. Okay. And if you do, you will have an accomplishment. And the accomplishment is what happens after you've made an investment. Many people are willing to help and support you along the way. The day that you have available to try might not be the weather day that makes your plan possible. But the safe and happy outcome is up to the pilot. Do we have any questions?
That looks like a good day. I think I'll go cross country.
I
Gee,
think so.
I think I'm ready. Maybe not.
Hey, Cindy, Greg had a question about when you're back on the chart there about using the minutes of longitude. The question is, are you using minutes of longitude to represent a statute mile at this altitude?
It was a nit at the time because you were going across the map, and those aren't.
These aren't perfect minutes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're minutes vertically on, but then they're nautical miles instead of
No.
statutes. And I was just curious if you were saying, well, at our latitude, those are about statute miles going across.
No, don't use the horizontal, the longitude ones. Use the vertical ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Here's another-
lats and longs are not the same.
Here's another thought for you. A lot of the beginners seem to think that you can buy performance and that'll solve all your problems.
Sure.
Let's give you a few rude thoughts. I've been flying open ship, 70-foot wingspan for 30 or 40 years. I can't stand small airports. I never land on roads, and there's a whole bunch of private airports I won't even think about landing on. You better
Exactly.
know where you're going to put that ship down or you're going to break it.
No, that's why we said we want span of 1.5 times of what we're flying. And that eliminates a lot of things.
This has been great, Cindy. And interestingly, I'm fairly new to this and flying out of Warner Springs, and have this last summer done my first real cross-country flying and was limiting myself to airports. But I looked down at Anza and saw some interesting fields, and I actually had the opportunity to drive out there and walk a couple of them yesterday.
That's the only way you should add them to your potential list.
Yeah.
Is with a sneaker check.
So interesting, I went to Google Maps as you were going through this because I had only sort of vaguely thought, well, they all look, I'll say, survivable. But just looking at, lighter color and direction on Google Maps now, I actually picked one that was actually nicest that I was walking through. So that's good. nice to think about, but also curious with some of the very small texture that's out there, or even furrows. If you're going to land into the wind, which is across a furrow, how hard a landing is that going to be and I'm in a Pegasus, so it's like a non-flapped ASW-20, and I touch down a little faster than a 126.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to beat the glider up really badly if you try to land cross furrows? Or
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Okay, so the question is,
Ear doors will come off.
yes. Okay. So I equate this discussion. This is a Cindyism. How fast are you willing to drive over the concrete bumpers in the parking lot at Walmart?
Okay.
Okay. If you decide to go over them at 30 miles an hour, you're going to tear something off the bottom of your car and screw up your alignment and all of that. Okay. And if you crawl over that same bumper at 3 miles an hour in your car, you aren't actually hurting it. Okay. But we can't get the glider down to 3 miles an hour when we touch an unflapped 15-meter ship. What is your stall speed clean in the air?
48 knots, I think, something like that.
Now, don't pick on him. Don't pick on him. He's
Sorry, 42 knots.
okay. So he says stall speed, straight line clean, is 42 knots up in the air at 3,000 AGL. All right. Is stall speed the same thing for that glider in ground effect?
No,
Which way does it change?
it's going to slow.
Correct. By how much do you think? Maybe. Just wild ass guess. 2 knots,
I don't know.
5 knots, 10 knots? Pick a
Yeah.
number.
Doesn't feel like that much.
Okay, so we'll give you 5 knots. So now instead of a 42 knot stall speed, what's your stall speed and ground effect?
So 35, 36.
Would you drive your car over those furrows
It's going to hurt.
35 miles an hour?
Yeah, not a good idea.
And your car has great suspension, and your glider has none.
None.
None. Okay, so you're doing the right thing. You went out and looked at places, and you are now beginning to build a mental, trustable database of, if I look at this place and it looks like this, I know what that means in your local neighborhood. When we were talking about flying across the Antelope Valley, these guys are looking at fields like what's on the screen right now. They may see deep, wet, tall, dark alfalfa. They may see freshly mowed alfalfa in between those rows. They may see fallow fields, but they've done a little bit of walking around and looking, and they've built their biology database a little bit for the local area. When I went over to fly the Avenal Spring Contest, usually I was the one hauling the trailer or the motorhome full of gear, and all the boys were flying over to have fun. That meant that I knew the difference between what carrots looked like, what soybeans looked like, what wine grapes looked like, what almond trees looked like, and I could identify those colors from the air. You've looked at the backside of Anza and some of the dry patches back there. Maybe you can tell me what 6-foot-tall cholla bushes look like. You know, it's a case of the value of being informed about what's in your neighborhood. Huh? And generally speaking, if you wouldn't want to drive your car through it at 35 miles an hour, you certainly wouldn't want to drive your glider through it at 35 miles an hour or 35 knots.
But, you know, there's another option there, that little north-south road. And if you look at it from the ground, what do you think? Looks like you could land on that road because there's no berm along it, because you walked on it, let's say.
But is that going to be into the wind, Walt?
Probably not in the Antelope Valley in the Mojave Desert. But
Okay.
It could be on one of those mountain wave days or thunderstormy days.
Absolutely, it could be. And knowing the difference about what the wind is might say, hey, this will be a little harder packed, okay, a little firmer than the ground that's been worked by the equipment. And those are valuable considerations. So Greg, have you learned something about visual assessments today?
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly walking and was part of that, because as I said, it was unclear. It's like I could tell there were a handful of survivable fields down there, and actually I know from conversation with others out there that people have landed somewhere in that general area successfully without hurting gliders. So
and some people have the ability to figure out what the GPS in their phone tells them for GPS coordinates, or they can take accurate road measurements or increments from an intersection. You can come home and mark it in Google Earth and get the coordinates, and then you can add that coordinate to your database for your electronic toy in your instrument panel. So you can build your own database for your own neighborhood. Don't take a database off of John Lee Bicker's Turnpoint Exchange and load it into your Cambridge 302 or your LX 9000 and figure that you'll be able to go to that place and visually identify and use exactly what was intended. using a database cold off of the library shelf is not a very good practice. As Mr. Chapman said, his airplane doesn't fit places where your glider will. Your skills don't fit where Walt's skills or Mike's skills might fit. Okay, these are personal choices, and they change with the glider that's being used, and they change with the weather of the day, and they change from April to October for an individual pilot based on how much flying they're doing. Cool. Any other good questions?
One general comment.
Yes, sir.
Mankind loves to make things flat. Any piece of ground that has been worked by man in the form of a field or almost anything else is probably, if it's big enough, is probably a better site than open desert. Open desert, other than dry lake beds in Southern California, is not your friend.
No, it's not.
Every
No, it's
bush,
not.
everything out there has got something that's going to grab a wingtip or a main gear, one or the other.
Yeah. Well, Walt Rogers here has a couple of fun tips about landing out, especially when your crew and it's dark when you take the glider apart and leave. I landed in a meadow once in out of Hobbs, New Mexico, and there was grass about 10 inches high or so, and I left my wing wheel there. And about 45 minutes after driving down the highway, I realized that I left it in this field. However, fun fact, if you write down your exact landing coordinates to 100th or 1,000th of a degree, latitude and longitude, you know what? You can actually go back to that field and find your wing wheel. Which is why I still have my Schemperth wing wheel.
Yeah. Coordinates can help for lots of things. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, Cindy,
Yeah, Dan, go ahead.
can you go on a little bit more about crop circles? Not, not aliens, but where I fly in, there's not a lot of crop circles, and I've never walked a crop circle, but when I went to Parowan, that was one of the things they pointed out and said, it's an option, but you have to be aware of, where that irrigation pipe is as it goes around and clocks around the field. And I think they said, don't land along, straight into the radius of the field, sort of cut it sideways so you're less likely to hit the divots. But
Right.
what type of crops are they growing? Is it grass or is it, I'm sure it's not corn.
Corn, wheat, potatoes.
It can be anything.
It could be anything. It's more common
Silage.
a grain or a forage crop more commonly.
Yes.
In our part of the world here, it's more commonly alfalfa or silage, which is a broad,
Say hi.
grassy kind of stuff, and can be easily 20 inches or more tall. And in heavy crop, it's going to be so dense that the deceleration when you touch it is going to be pretty abrupt. So when we were looking at the alfalfa in the rectangle fields here that's up on the screen, you can see the difference between very rich dark green, which is a very dense crop, and tall. And if you look at the lesser saturation of green, it is wet growth, but it's not as tall and it's not as dense. So you will have less abrupt deceleration in terms of the coloration. If the field is freshly mowed, it looks almost like bare dirt, but there's a different tone to these mowed fields versus first year growth without irrigation, which is an uneven texture. But I'm sure you're seeing my laser pointer as we're talking about these different colored fields.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so the uneven texture of a field that is only in the first year of fallow and early enough in the season that there's enough wetness to the soil that the plants are still growing in the desert. Here's a circle that's been fallow way longer, 6 or 8 or 10 years. This field's been fallow.
That just looks like an ugly choice, that last one.
That's a very ugly choice. Remember we were talking about the size of bushes versus lanes of traffic? So you can look at that and say, that's huge bushes, okay? The irrigation line itself, the pipe on the wheels is enormous on these center pivots. The water line itself is suspended 8 or 10 feet above the ground. So the wheels that these things are rolling on is supporting the weight of a 6-inch water main that's running 1,200 feet. How many gallons of water is that? Oh my God, just what's sitting in the pipe. So the wheels that suspend this pipe as it goes around the field make pretty wicked deep furrows, okay? And you don't want to have to roll through one of those. You'd probably rather be at slow speed and ground loop to avoid going through one of those, probably, okay? That's why they talk about landing on a diagonal related to the circumference rather than on a radial. If you land on a radial, you're going to cross multiple furrows. If you land sort of parallel on a faceted circumference, you might be able to miss some of the furrows and the obstacles. Okay.
And my last question was, how visible are the bales? Because when you cut a field, the next thing you do is you bale it up, and now you got the field covered with things the size of cars.
Okay. In Utah, they commonly bale what are called big bales, and those are as big as pickup trucks. Okay. And those are extremely easy to see. When you have fields that are this size, this is older traditional family farming rather than agribusiness, if you will. And so the bales on this style of field are more likely to be 2 by 2 by 4. And those are the bales that the farmer picks up and puts on the back of his F-150 truck and drives home for his saddle horse and his kids' goats. Okay. But there's standard bales, which are 2 by 2 by 4. And then there's big bales, which are 1,500 pounds in and of themselves. And I don't know what the dimensions on them are, but they're like 6 by 6 by 8.
Or the 6-foot round bales.
Or big round bales, right? Okay. So
Cindy?
driving into Parowan, look around. Look at the agricultural fields. What's the style of the irrigation? The worst are rainbirds on fixed lines in carrot fields, because those are only going to stand up 18 inches above the ground. They're only 3/4 inch or 1 inch pipe, very small. If the crop, the potatoes or the carrots or the rutabagas, are camouflaging where the physical lines are. So in that case, you better land with the furrows, because that's also the way that the lines of the rainbird lines are laying out. But you hope that if you're landing with the furrows and with the irrigation lines, like north-south here in the middle, you're hoping that you've got enough dry line space in there for a span and a half between where the rainbirds are laying. Mike, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just in context, Central Washington, the Snake River Plain, parts of northern Utah, they'll grow anything from wheat, soybean, corn, in circle crops. It depends on whether or not the farmer rotates their crops through the years, but it can be anything in the desert. It's whatever the farmer can get money for. And those divots in our area and anywhere where it's sandy or stuff, they're 12 to 18 inches deep and about 1.5 feet wide.
Huge.
So,
Indeed, John Chapman, one more. You've given
Sure,
a
John, go
great
ahead.
overview of a lot of the selection criteria for a particular field. I think your advanced lesson should be how to plan your landing approach, because 2 fields back is where you're going to be dodging power lines and telephone poles and God knows what else.
Right. Yeah. Well, great. I
And did-
appreciate this talk, Cindy. This has been really informative and just a lot of good insights and just general how-to. So I agree. John's got a good idea for a part 2 to this, and maybe someone else like John, yourself, or somebody wants to take out part 2. But this has been really great. And so next week we'll go back to Walt, Mr. Weatherman Walt, to give us more insight and tips on weather planning and weather tools. Is there anything you want to say about next week, Walt?
No, well, yeah, what I want to say is I'm going to take a specific example of Wednesday evening. Let's see how the weather is going to be the next weekend, say Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And I'm going to go through what I look at, and we'll discuss what I look at specifically and why. And as I hop around between different charts and maps, I'll show you my thinking as to picking what the good day is and what the poor days are, and use some of those tools.
Great.
I think it's worth pointing out here in Southern California also that you're talking about fields, that grape fields are filled with metal pipes and wires, and you will die if you land in one of them.
Up in Calistoga, we used to call them egg slicers.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a landing on a field, Cindy may remember this, Birches Strip between north of Cal City. And I landed on this really nice little small airport with dirt strips and a hangar and a house. They were slaughtering chickens that day, and they watched me circle down as I landed, I found out later. So I set up a nice approach to land toward the hangar on this dirt strip. At short final, at about 50 feet, I see there's little wire markers alongside the runway that are too narrow, and they have what looks like reflectors on them. What would you do? Well, what I did was proceed according to plan to land down the center line. And they were little tiny wires with little plastic reflectors on them, and it just tick, 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 broke a couple of them, and that's all the damage it did. It didn't do any damage to the glider. And he said,
Wow.
don't worry about the reflectors. But when you're on short final like that, you know, sometimes you just have to say, well, I just hope they're small and light and they break.
Right.
I don't think anybody would have put something alongside a runway. They were markers for landing at night probably, and they weren't meant to be very sturdy. So that's something to think about on short final for maybe then part 2. What do you do when things aren't looking right? You could make it worse by doing something radical.
Sure, that's where some of the senior pilots who've had these kind of experiences can share stories and give us, you know, some newbies like myself, some good tips and insights. So,
yeah.
All right, everybody. Well, everybody have a great week. And again, thank you so much, Cindy. Your insights and tips are always really appreciated. And everybody just stay safe and have a good week. And we will see you next Wednesday.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is really awesome. Thanks.
Thank you, fellas.